Greetings. This slideshow provides information about the University of Georgia's revised appointment, promotion, and tenure guidelines related to teaching contributions. The slide deck is intended to be useful for faculty aiming to describe their contributions to teaching for promotion and tenure, for department leadership mentoring faculty through the P&T process, and for P&T committee members and others voting on P&T at all levels of the university. This session should be useful for learning how and why the guidelines have been revised, for identifying dossier components that are consistent with the revised guidelines, and for developing ideas of how to assemble a dossier that is consistent with the revised guidelines. The University of Georgia has a long-term goal of improving the effectiveness and inclusiveness of instruction university-wide. To make progress toward this goal, policies and practices are evolving to reflect current research and effective practices related to teaching, learning, and faculty evaluation. The appointment, promotion, and tenure guidelines for contribution to teaching were revised in 2020 to reflect this evolution. Specifically, the revisions are intended to broaden and clarify the types of evidence that can be used to document teaching effectiveness and accomplishments, to improve the quality of judgments that can be made about a candidate's contributions to teaching, to apply broadly across disciplines, and to serve all students who enroll at the University of Georgia with their diverse goals, interests, and abilities. These new guidelines are in effect as of fall 2021. In order to understand the revisions, it's helpful to know that effective and fair teaching evaluation includes evidence from three important perspectives in the education ecosystem: students, peers, and the instructor themselves. By including these three perspectives, it's possible to develop a more complete picture of a faculty member's teaching, and thus evaluate them more fairly and holistically. The revisions reflected three overarching types of changes. First, the guidelines used to refer to teaching contributions in terms of teaching excellence, which was not defined. The guidelines now make use of the terms effective and effectiveness, which means that data have been systematically collected and analyzed to support claims about teaching quality and teaching improvement. In order to demonstrate the effectiveness of their teaching, faculty can now include new and different forms of evidence that are indicators of student learning and development. For instance, dossiers can now include student performance from program outcomes assessment. This is good because it makes it possible to kill two birds with one stone. Data can be used for P&T and for program assessment. Dossiers can also include student work, sometimes referred to as student artifacts. This is valuable because it's more direct evidence of what students have learned or what they know and can do as a result of instruction than student letters or testimonials. In addition, evidence of graduate student progress toward degree, retention of students in programs and research groups, or student scholarship or creative works can now be included. These types of evidence move beyond simply listing the number of students by showing the extent to which students are making progress toward degree completion, by revealing whether or not there are patterns of student exiting faculty members' research groups, and the extent to which students are being supported in their scholarly and creative work. Observations of instruction by trained peers over time using established measures of effective teaching can also be included. This moves away from haphazard and uninformative letters from colleagues toward actually documenting teaching effectiveness by ensuring peers are trained, peers use tools that have some evidence of effectiveness for examining teaching, and that there are multiple observations, which can provide a more holistic evaluation of the faculty member's teaching and give them a chance to improve. Finally, the types of evidence that can be included has been expanded to reflect modern teaching by explicitly referencing online instruction. The revised guidelines have also been changed to emphasize gathering, reviewing, and presenting evidence in an organized and methodical way to reduce potential for bias. For instance, the guidelines now call for the presentation of multiple forms of evidence, not just one. The use of multiple forms of evidence provides a more holistic picture of teaching effectiveness than using just one source of evidence. The guidelines now stipulate that peer observations must be carried out by trained peer observers using established ways of observing teaching. This ensures that they carry out their evaluations in a consistent and fair way. Observing at multiple time points also helps avoid any single observation from carrying too much weight, and allows observers to see a trajectory over time. To further mitigate bias, the guidelines now indicate that balanced feedback from students should be presented, rather than cherry-picking a subset of comments. This ensures a fair representation of the student experience. Accompanying this with this faculty member's perspective clarifies factors that may influence student concerns and how the faculty member has responded to them. The last shift relates to the idea of continuous improvement. The main issue is that many faculty are not trained to teach, and thus it is unfair to assume they will be highly effective the first time they teach. The key is showing a positive trajectory that is based on evidence. The dossier should focus on presenting a cycle of collecting and analyzing student-related data, whether that's data related to learning, inclusion, or other student outcomes, then making decisions of what to change, making the change, and collecting and analyzing data to evaluate whether and how the change worked. The guidelines now set faculty members up to be able to demonstrate improvement over time. For instance, peer observations of teaching are expected to be done at multiple time points. Dossiers can include instructor reflections over time so instructors can explain how they have taken action based on the evidence they have collected. Faculty can also present evidence that they have sought out professional development, how they have taken action as a result of the professional development, and how this has affected their teaching and their students' learning. Now let's take a look at a few examples of what these changes can look like in an actual dossier. The example is from a real faculty member with some tweaks to protect identities and to make it a bit easier to digest in this context. You will see one part of the dossier at a time, starting with the component related to the student voice. Consider pausing the video and taking a few minutes to read this example. Write down what you notice. What helps you evaluate the effectiveness of this person's teaching? How has the faculty member presented data fairly and over time? Hopefully you noticed a few features. First, the faculty member included response rates, which helps dossier evaluators to get a sense of how representative or biased the student feedback may be. Second, the data are longitudinal, which allows dossier evaluators to assess whether the instruction has improved over time. Finally, the comments summarize the data and assess whether the data indicate improvement in instruction. It's important to note that the presentation of the data doesn't avoid the less than positive results, but rather emphasizes presenting all of the data for key questions and presenting those data over time. Now let's look at the evidence related to peer voice. Again, consider pausing the video and taking a few minutes to read this example and write down what you notice. Think about what helps you evaluate the effectiveness of this person's teaching and how they have presented the data fairly and over time. Here are a few things you might have noticed. First, peers are colleagues who have some familiarity with the discipline of the faculty member. Peers like this are an important source of feedback about teaching because they have knowledge of the discipline and of the students who typically take the course. While the Center for Teaching and Learning has expertise on teaching evaluation in general and is an important source of information about how to carry out peer observations of instruction, they are not experts in the discipline and will not know the students as well as the faculty members who work with them every day. This example also includes a clear definition of what the department views as effective teaching, basically what the target is that the faculty member should be aiming for, so that peers know what to observe and give feedback about, and dossier evaluators can assess alignment between the target and the faculty member's teaching. Notice that the definition was generated by the department through discussion over time and shared with the faculty so they can use it in their teaching and teaching evaluation. Notice that the peer feedback explicitly addresses elements of the definition, thereby addressing the effectiveness of the instruction. Again, the data are longitudinal, meaning that there were at least 2 peer observations and rounds of feedback. This allowed the faculty member to make improvements based on initial feedback. Finally, the data include both strengths and areas for improvement, rather than cherry-picking certain feedback. This reduces bias in the presentation of the evidence. Now let's look at the last source of evidence, the instructor themselves. Self-reflections provided a space for faculty to explain why they are teaching the way they are, including what changes they are making over time to improve, and their assessment of how the changes are working or not. Again, consider pausing the video to read this example and write down what you notice. Think about what helps you to evaluate the effectiveness of this person's teaching, and how they have presented the data fairly and over time. Here are a few things you might have noticed. One strength of this example is reflection on evidence, rather than just the instructor's opinion. The faculty member systematically collected and analyzed the student feedback, rather than cherry-picking particular student comments. This allows for stronger inferences to be made about what could or should be improved. It's important to note that this example has student feedback as the data, but lots of things can count as data. For instance, data can also include the work students complete in a course, responses to test questions or assignment questions, performance on projects or reports, or other demonstrations of student knowledge and skills, or even retention or attrition rates. It may be helpful to keep in mind the difference between data and evidence. Evidence is what should be included in the dossier rather than raw data. In this example, the data are the student responses and feedback, and the evidence is the trends that are identified from reviewing and analyzing the data. Several elements of this example illustrate how the faculty member took steps to reduce bias in the presentation of evidence. For instance, the faculty member identified trends in student responses, not just highlighting one or a very few favorable responses. The faculty member also attends to both strengths and areas for improvement. And the faculty member involves a colleague to provide an outside perspective. Yet another strength is the fact that the instructor decides what to do based on the evidence and reflects on whether or how their actions led to intended improvements. Finally, the instructor examines the evidence over time, again to identify and document any improvements. Hopefully you have a better sense of how and why the guidelines have been revised, and hopefully you have ideas about how you can put together a dossier that presents your contributions to teaching in a way that showcases your teaching effectiveness and efforts to improve your teaching, and also protects you from potential biases that can affect the evaluation process. Thanks for your interest and attention, and for your efforts to improve teaching and learning here at the University of Georgia.